This state of play production is made possible by the generous support of Biogen, Biogen, where science meets humanity.
I'm Sharon Pratt, and as you know, State of Play, this series is focused on the role of African American women in particular in the quest for political equality. We have someone who is probably the ultimate expert in this space, Professor Martha Jones. She is a legal scholar, an historian. She says she's a public historian, and she brings all of these talents to her position with Johns Hopkins University. And in particular, today, we want to talk about her many works, and in the latest being that we want to focus on is Vanguard. Honored to have you with us, Professor Jones.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much, Mayor Pratt.
So as we talk about this dynamic of African American women in particular, our role in the quest for political equality, you give it a lot of attention. What inspired you to particularly focus on African American women? Because I know your general thrust is the role of African Americans and the role of African Americans in the evolution of the country. What inspired you to really zero in on African American women in particular?
This book was inspired importantly by what was then the upcoming 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the so-called Women's Suffrage Amendment. And I had some signs, some inkling that in all of the commemorations and celebrations, it was possible that Black women might be overlooked. And I thought to myself, not in 2020. We are going to make sure that the important, critical, visionary role that Black women have played in the long struggle for voting rights is part of that story. I wind up thinking about the 19th Amendment moment, but before I'm done, I've written almost 200 years of Black women's political history to give that moment important context.
So in 1848, where there was the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, were any African American women in attendance?
No, there were not, as best we know, though there were Black women living in the village of Seneca Falls. We've no record of any of them being there. But just as important, my work has been, rather than looking for Black women where they were not, is to follow them where they were. And it turns out that in the spring of 1848, Black women are gathered around claiming their power, not in Seneca Falls, but in Philadelphia, where the General Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church is meeting, and Black women are there to demand their rights. They want preaching licenses equal to the preaching licenses of men. And so we see how Black women are deeply engaged with some of the questions that animate Seneca Falls, but they're waging that struggle in their own communities.
Well, a lot of your work is devoted to the role of African American women and the struggles of African American women in being heard in the church. And these were, AME churches, etc. These were churches of our community. Why so much a focus on the struggle within the churches?
I know some readers will be surprised that this book begins with a preaching woman in the early 19th century, the great Jarena Lee, in the AME church. But it turns out that struggles over church politics, over gender and power in Black Methodist and Baptist churches is really the crucible for Black women's thinking, for the development of their political skills. And ultimately, the churches are what launched them into secular spaces like anti-slavery societies, like the club movement of the late 19th century, and even to civil rights organizations. So again, when we miss Black churches, we miss a critical part of the story. And many of the women who begin their activism in religious circles will take that out into the secular realm and begin to use it to claim political rights like the right to vote.
Well, the church has certainly played an outsized role in the African American community. So I guess it would be a natural platform. And yet we saw a real resistance really from the men in terms of these women playing an equal role or even any role.
Absolutely. I'll take us to the end of the 19th century, which is an extraordinary moment because, for example, we have the founding of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, what becomes the premier Black women's suffrage association. Well, the backdrop to that is struggles within Black Methodist and Baptist churches over women's leadership. And men are, I think, challenged precisely because they are, how can I put it? Because they hear resonances of the critiques that they have long leveled at slavery and racism now being echoed through women's claims for equality. So there are Black women, Black men allies to Black women in these early struggles for women's political rights. But you are right. There are others who are really perplexed by the notion that the same arguments that should defeat racism should also defeat sexism in political life.
Well, there's an undercurrent of this, at least I thought I saw an undercurrent of this in your narratives that you just sort of alluded to a moment ago, and that is the whole dynamic of being enslaved at one point and that race being such a dominant factor in defining any African American in this country, heightened the struggle, heightened the sensitivity of these dynamics of women taking center stage in any way. It was threatening, was it not, to the dignity of African American men?
Well, I think that some Black men would have put it just that way. And yet what a woman like Maria Stewart in 1830 in Boston, she takes to the podium and she says, we are wasting, some of our best resources. We're squandering, right, our strength when we set women to the margins, when we exclude women from deliberation, when we exclude them from leadership in the struggle against slavery and the struggle in a free city like Boston for civil rights. So part of my point in Vanguard is to help us see that this has always been a debate, that in any moment we can find folks on two sides of this question, but Black women are looking to define their particular stakes in political rights. And that is part of the hard history, because part of what Black women are drawing our attention to is the violence that they confront, especially in ladies' cars as they travel, the ever-present and very real threat of sexual violence. And so Black women have their own message to bring to these scenes, not messages that men carry well or easily. And so they become, I hope in this story, indispensable characters precisely because they expand our sensibility about what the scourge of slavery and racism was. And they expand our sense of what the vision, right, for freedom and citizenship.
So what would you say are the organizations that kind of trigger a growing independence on the part of African American women? What are the organizations that sort of propel African American women more to center stage?
Yes, I think we can't ever overlook the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, founded in 1896 at a very difficult moment in the history of Black Americans. At the moment that Jim Crow is gaining traction and beginning to reign supreme in the southern states, Black women organize and commit themselves to their own interests, but more broadly to the struggle against lynching, for the vote, and a great deal more. The women of the NACWC will be on the front lines of the struggle for the 19th Amendment to win voting rights. And in 1920, when Black women are profoundly disappointed by a 19th Amendment that does not get many of them, enough of them, to the polls, it is women in that organization who are going to pick up the challenge and help to build a new movement for voting rights that will take us all the way to the 20th century and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And there were, what, 100,000 followers or members of...
That is right. Yes. And that, I think, sometimes I think that organization is parodied as a haven for elite women. And certainly there are extraordinary leading women like the great Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, Margaret Murray Washington, and others, oftentimes at the helm. But that number, 100,000, tells us something about the reach and how local this organization is, and its strength is that capacity to build a network that I think still we see evidence today on any given election day, right? Those old networks, those old relationships being organized and activated to get Black women to the polls as a voting bloc, those go all the way back to the earliest days of the National Association.
And then we speak of the 19th Amendment, but before that, we had the 1913 Women's March. I know Ida B. Wells participated, Mary Church Terrell, and there was pushback. Was there not, even among Alice Paul and others, to allow African-American women to participate?
Absolutely, right. An unprecedented gathering, ultimately 5,000 women upstaging Woodrow Wilson on the eve of his inauguration to put women's suffrage on the national plate. Black women are there because they are not willing to cede wholly national leadership, even to an organization like NASA, which is trading in anti-Black racism in its campaign for the 19th Amendment. Women like Terrell, women like Wells, and many others who were there that day are there to say Black women have a stake in this struggle, and we are not here to be represented by others. That's what Paul would have preferred, is if Black women let white women represent their interests in that, as that campaign is gaining momentum.
Well, there's so much territory to cover. I'm going to hit a little bit of it, even though I know we're running out of time. I mean, you hit on so many people. Obviously, Shirley Chisholm, we have Fannie Lou Hamer, et cetera, as we go into the 20th century. Finally, in 2021, we're beginning to see African-American women a little bit more center stage. Of those women of the 20th century, is there anyone that is more of an outsized personality, do you think, in terms of catapulting African-American women to center stage?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. Today, Black women are not simply firsts, and I'm sitting with a great first in this conversation. Black women are not only first, right? Black women are a force in American politics. And I would point to, there's so many, but I would point to leader Stacey Abrams, who I think really embodies the spirit and the vision of the women of Vanguard. One, because when we ask leader Abrams about whose shoulders she stands upon, she tells us, I stand on the shoulders of the great Sojourner Truth, of Harriet Tubman, right? She's carrying that history into the present. And at the same time, leader Abrams is someone who is extraordinarily nimble in American politics. And this is one of the signatures of the women of Vanguard. As you know, she is defeated in her run for the governorship of the state of Georgia. Well, Stacey Abrams doesn't sit down. Leader Abrams does not go home. She pivots and she moves to organizing. And now, as we know, she's once again going to run for the governorship. And I think this is a signature of Black women in politics, the kind of nimbleness, the kind of versatility, the capacity to respond to the conditions on the ground as we find them is part of what has made us a force, even in the face of those who were doubters, those who have been naysayers, those who have stood in opposition. I think that skill set is really what has brought Black women to the fore as a force.
No, one of my mentors that I was honored to have as a mentor was Patricia Roberts Harris. She was Dean of Women when I attended Howard. And I remember her saying, when they say Black, they mean men. When they say women, they mean white. You know, up until very recently, Black women were rarely center stage. We were often marginalized. And so, but what you have so beautifully presented in your work is that Black women were always there advancing political equality, not just for other Black people, but for women generally, for all of humanity. Professor Jones, we can't thank you enough for the great work that you've been doing, continue to do, and the very brilliant way you share it with the American people. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being here on State of Play.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.